Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're just getting started and folks are still joining. So we will be waiting a few moments while folks join. But in the meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, you can go in and just share your name, your location, if you are with a congregation or a state affiliate, please let us know that as well. And we'll get to know each other in the chat just a little bit. All right, so welcome everyone. I see folks introducing themselves in the chat. Please continue to do so we can get to know who's here this afternoon. We want to welcome you to this webinar, and we appreciate you being here for this important conversation on how faith communities are engaging at COP28, which is the United Nations Climate Conference. This year's conference, of course, takes place in Dubai and starts on November 30th, so a little bit later this year than we're used to, but we are all gearing up for that. And so we want to share some important information with you today. My name is Reverend Susan Hendershot, and I serve as the president of Interfaith Power and Light. And our mission is to inspire and mobilize people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. And so I want to share just a little bit of housekeeping here at the beginning of the call. Our attendees today, you are muted and you will not be able to unmute in the webinar format. So we invite you to use the chat function for comments. And we ask you to please use the Q&A feature for questions. And if you're not familiar with the Q&A feature, you'll see a button at the lower part of the screen that says Q&A. And you can drop your questions in there and we will do our best to answer them either live or in writing during the webinar. And so just using that function helps us to keep track of the questions a little bit better, because the chat can sometimes be very busy and we might lose sight of your questions in there. And so as we get started today, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. And first, I want to acknowledge that where I am here in Northern Virginia, as in every other part of the country, we are on indigenous land. And I recognize that I live and work within the ancestral lands of the Manahoac people. I acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these peoples, and I am grateful for their stewardship of these lands. And I invite you to place in the chat the name of the people whose land you rely upon. And if you're not sure, we will drop in the chat the link to where you can find the land whose people you rely upon. So please check that out if you're not familiar. So I'm going to start just a little bit by talking about why we're here today. And people of faith understand the importance of using their prophetic voice to call the faithful to live by their most deeply held values. This December, Interfaith Power and Light and many of our faith partners will have a presence as an observer organization at COP28 in Dubai to ensure that world leaders hear the moral voice as they debate strategies and ambitions to effectively tackle the global challenge of climate change. Our witness is crucial, and I'm delighted to be hosting this conversation today with three incredible climate and environmental justice advocates who have been bringing the faith voice to these UN climate negotiations for many years. So we will have time for Q&A towards the end of the hour, so please remember to drop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get them answered. So I want to introduce our three panelists who are with us today. So first we have Bea Moorhead. Bea serves as the Executive Director of Texas Impact and Texas Interfaith Power and Light, which is one of the state affiliates in our IPL network. And she's been in that role since the year 2000. Prior to that, Bea spent 8 years as a senior fiscal policy analyst for former Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts and she was responsible for the comptroller's attention to public policy issues related to health and human services. So welcome, Pete. We're glad to have you here. Next, we have Regina Banks. Regina is a womanist climate activist and professional advocate for economic, social, and political justice. She currently serves as the director of the Lutheran Office of Public Policy, California, and chair of Lutheran Social Services of Northern California. Regina is a proud alumna of Valparaiso University School of Law and Lincoln University in Missouri, and she lives in her hometown of Sacramento, California. In her spare time, she works on several social justice issues, including housing security and ending the corrosive influence of money in public policy. Welcome, Regina. And John Hill. John serves as the interim general secretary at the United Methodist Church's Board of Church and Society, where he directs the agency's vision, mission, and mandate for witness and action on issues of human well-being, justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. A native of Florida and graduate of the University of Virginia, John is an advocate with 30 years of experience in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the board in 2002, he worked on Capitol Hill as a legislative aide and later served as the director of legislative affairs for a lobbying and consulting firm in D.C. So welcome, John. Good to have all of you here. And I also want to extend thanks to our IPL team members, Rebecca and Bill, who are overseeing our technology today, and they are also serving as part of the IPL delegation to COP28 this year. So as we begin, we want to start with a video clip that was produced by Texas Interfaith Power and Light a couple of years ago, but is still very relevant for our work today, to just talk about why faith communities are at the COP and why we engage in these climate conferences. So let's go ahead and watch that video together. We are having a little bit of sound difficulty, so give us a moment and we'll go back and fix that. Rebecca, if we could pause and start over, then I think you have to unmute your computer to reshare.
The world is getting hotter and more dangerous, faster than we ever thought possible. Irreversible tipping points are within Irreversible tipping points are within sight and hurtling towards us. As the logo for COP25 suggests, it is 5 minutes to midnight in the global climate emergency. By the end of the coming decades, we will be on one of two paths. One is the path of surrender, where we have sleepwalked past the point of no return, jeopardizing the health and safety of everyone on this planet.
I think one of the challenges when we talk about the UNFCCC the Framework Convention on Climate Change and these COPs is that they seem very disconnected from things that we normally engage with.
I think it's kind of interesting. You know, we've been talking about decoding the COP for faith communities back home. And I think essentially what we're talking about is the fact that what happens here at the international level is really interconnected to what happens both back home at the federal level and then also at the local and state level.
We want to make sure that our folks understand that dealing with the environment, addressing climate change, is not a separate ministry, but it's a ministry of the church.
My name is Linnea May. I serve as the Episcopal Church's representative to the United Nations. The United Nations is made up of countries, member states, as we call them. There are member states, and then which consists of governments, and then we have another sector called non-governmental organizations, or you may hear it referred to as civil society, which is the rest of us. So that could include companies, it can include universities, trade unions, and it also includes faith-based organizations.
My name is Bill Simplowski Jarman, and I worked for 32 years for the national offices of the Presbyterian Church, and I'm here as a volunteer to help involve the church continuously in the efforts to fight climate change. We've been present at this whole process from the very beginning in 1992 at the Earth Summit when they signed the convention. World leaders, 190 of them descended upon Rio to sign that convention and one on biodiversity. The religious and faith-based communities were here to participate in that process, and we've been here ever since.
The word COP has nothing to do with law enforcement, although in some ways it does, but it's called the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the parties, this is a conference of parties. So it doesn't mean there are millions of parties happening, although they do happen. Nice, polite receptions. But the parties are the actual signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the major piece of international legislation around the environment and climate that came into force around 2000. So the Conference of Parties refers to the member states who have signed the Framework Convention. So they're called the parties. So we are not part of the party. We are the crashers of the party, so to speak, the observers who come along, and we have the right to be here. But we are here to observe and not to vote or make decisions at the COP. That said, the role we have here is very, very important all the same.
The Framework Convention began as a response to a scientific assessment. And I think many of the first COPs were very focused on the sort of scientific, and you see even in the work stream still a reflection of that science-focused, evidence-based work, really important. But the scientists can diagnose the problem. They may not be the best to address the solutions. And so having the voices of frontline communities, indigenous communities, people of faith, others who are sort of living the realities of the changing climate every day, be it in response to disasters, communities that are either sending or receiving migrants, having those voices as part of the solution is really important. And so I think from my own understanding of my faith and my sort of particular United Methodist lens, that sense of connection and justice is really important to me.
I think that we like our issues siloed because it feels easier, to manage, just like, climate change or hunger or water, immigration, whatever it is. And climate change is a big tent issue, right? It is so intersected to all of these other issues. It exacerbates all of these other issues. And for me personally, I came to the issue of climate change through the lens of hunger. That was the issue that I worked on for many years as a pastor in a local congregation, was the issue of hunger. And it wasn't until I made the connection between, the loss of harvest due to drought and wildfire that were fueled by climate change and increasing global food shortages and rising grain prices and the rise of conflict in some parts of the world around that, I was able to make the connection that, I need to work on climate change.
We had the opportunity at this COP to meet with the U.S. delegation from Congress. That was a bicameral delegation led by Speaker Pelosi.
We're here to talk positively about our agenda to save the planet for future generations.
And to a person, they said they needed to hear more from people of faith in their communities, hear from it from the pulpit, hear from it into their offices. So I think the first and foremost that folks can do is speak up and speak out. It's important for us as people of faith to raise our voice, to talk about our moral call for climate action, and to stand in solidarity with those who are being impacted by a changing climate.
Do we really
Hey, well, I think we cut off the Secretary General at the end here, but that's okay. We're gonna shift back to our panel now. So we want to thank the team for fixing the sound issues on this, and we're gonna move forward. And we certainly want to thank Texas Impact for the Path of Hope resource. I dropped the link into the chat for folks so you can find that online. It's a great resource to use in your faith communities, both ahead of and during the COP, as well as for your own personal use. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. And as we get started, I want to share just a quick update on the Global Religious Leaders Summit, which took place in Abu Dhabi last week, and which I attended. And one of the outcomes from that was the release of a religious leader statement on COP28, and that was delivered at that gathering to the COP28 president-elect. We can drop a link to that resource in the chat for you so you can see the full statement. But I did want to share just some of the asks that were included in that statement. And this was signed by about the representatives of about 30 major religious traditions globally at that gathering. So some of those asks included to urge businesses and policymakers to adopt a rapid, just transition away from fossil fuels, embracing clean energy sources that nurture the earth and safeguard its inhabitants unconditionally. A call on governments to promote sustainable agriculture and resilient food systems that respect local cultures and ecosystems while ensuring food security for all. A call on governments to enhance services to address the burden of climate change on human health, especially in the most vulnerable and fragile communities. Beseeching financial institutions, IFIs, private sector companies, and governments to adopt responsible investments and business practices aligned with climate, environmental, and social standards. A call on governments to establish accountability mechanisms for the fulfillment of global and national commitments to inclusive climate action, and asking governments to commit to the operationalization of new financial mechanisms that address loss and damage, especially in the most vulnerable regions, and ensure that this fund is interdisciplinary, effective, and inclusive, and directly reaches the most vulnerable or affected communities. And of course, this followed very closely upon Pope Francis's release of Laudato Deum. And of course, Pope Francis, probably many of you have heard, has committed to attending COP28, the first time a Pope has ever attended one of these conferences. And this is the first year that the COP will include a faith pavilion with more than 100 organizations represented in 60 events throughout the COP, and also offering pastoral care to negotiators. So it's interesting to me as we sit in this moment in time that I think that we're entering this COP with momentum when it comes to the inclusion of the faith voice, which I think is very significant for us to note. And so I want to turn to our panelists now with some questions, and I want to start, B, with you. I know that this year is a bit different for the U.S. going into these climate negotiations, and so I wonder if you can just share with us how the U.S. is positioned going into this COP.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So the biggest distinction between this year and the past several years, and John actually has a much longer track record than I do, and there have been other times that the United States was not well positioned, but for the past several years during the Trump administration, the United States was not well positioned in the climate negotiations. We were antagonistic toward the process. This year, we're going in having passed the Inflation Reduction Act, where the administration is making really aggressive moves to implement renewable energy and energy efficiency, also to at least take steps domestically to address some aspects of climate justice and energy justice. So, and of course, we're about to have a rule come out on methane, which is an increasingly important topic at the COP. So there's lots of things that make us as Americans feel less like pariahs in the process, perhaps. There's a couple of things that don't fit that narrative. One of them is that our Congress is not necessarily in the greatest shape right now, just in terms of its ability to make decisions and work in concert towards common goals. And the other one, yeah, we could have government shutdown coinciding with the COP. That seems like it would be not beneficial. The other thing that I want to bring up, and it's partly because I'm in Texas, and right now today in Texas, we are having an absolutely bananas conversation about immigration, but migration is so deeply related to climate. And in the United States right now, we are seeing kind of positive trend of Americans who do think we should do something about climate. We are unfortunately seeing really bad trends as far as American frustration with global migration. And those two things for the faith community are going to come together in a terrible way if we are not strong and prophetic in our witness. The last thing I want to say is that today, and actually right this second, the White House is holding a webinar, but ours was scheduled first, so we probably have more people on ours, about the 5th National Climate Assessment. I was lucky enough to be a co-author on one of the chapters of the 5th National Climate Assessment. This is the assessment, the multi-federal agency assessment of where the United States stands with respect to climate change. And you can find lots of information about it online, but it's an amazing day to be releasing it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bea. And thanks for your work on that. An incredibly important report that I know, you know, many folks on this webinar probably are aware that came out today, and maybe already poring over it for more information heading into the COP. And so, John, I want to turn to you. As Bea said, you've been, you know, part of these, you know, COP delegations for a long time, and been following many of the issues for a very long time. What are some of the major issues that you expect to be negotiated at this COP, and which ones do you think the most resonant for U.S. faith communities?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone, for joining this afternoon. You know, the COPs tend to be, for many of us, this kind of annual checkup and check-in on all things climate. So there are the negotiations that happen in the formal setting, and then there's an exhibition space, and there's, you know, the non-state actors, the NGOs, businesses that are there. And in some ways, it's kind of this collective check-in on how we're doing and how much we're trying to sort of accelerate and learn from each other how we might increase our ambition. At this particular COP, that kind of informal check-in that we all do is formalized in a process called the Global Stocktake. And so, similar to what Bea just mentioned with the 5th National Climate Assessment, this was set up under the Paris Agreement, and it is intended to be sort of a multi-streamed process to measure progress towards the goals under the Paris Agreement, and then to inform how we might update or enhance action related to those goals. What we know from the synthesis report that was released just a few weeks ago, and it confirms what we suspect, that we're not on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think the question for this COP is how the actions of this COP are going to respond to that assessment, right? Both in the collective update of the work and the goals of under the Framework Convention, under the Paris Agreement, so reflected in the COP decision text, and then how individual parties are going to update their own nationally determined contributions next year in light of that global stocktake. So that's one of the biggest conversations and something that we'll hear a lot about throughout the COP. And then really against that backdrop, much of the conversation is going to focus on how we mobilize and catalyze greater ambition to both reduce the causes of climate change, the mitigation side, and then how we scale up finance to address the realities of the climate crisis. Finance for a transition to a green energy future, finance for a just transition, finance to help countries adapt to the realities of climate change, and then finance to support countries who are suffering irreparable loss and damages, right? So those changes that are beyond anyone's country's ability to adapt. On the mitigation side, the focus is really on rapidly reducing emissions, particularly near-term emissions, right? Emissions before pre-2030. I think we're going to hear a lot of conversations about fossil phase out. Apologize, I just lost you all on Zoom, thanks. So we're going to hear a lot about the importance of rapidly phasing out fossil fuels. I think there has been and continues to be some underlying skepticism about this COP, given that the COP president designate, who will be the COP from UAE, is also the chief executive of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So commitments to fully phasing out fossil fuels may not be primary on his agenda. I think it's important for those of us in the faith community to put that, to hold that up as primary to the agenda. I will say the president has signaled eagerness to rapidly ramp up renewables. So we'll hear a lot of conversation about that, but just as important to really focus on that fossil phase out on the mitigation side. Lastly, just on the finance, this COP presidency has said in his initial kind of goals and expectations for the COP that this COP should transform climate finance by delivering on old promises and establishing a new financial framework. So the old promises, the very first COP I went to, which was COP15 in Copenhagen, countries pledged to mobilize $100 billion annually for adaptation by 2020. And the developing countries have fallen far short of that goal. And really pales in comparison, that goal even pales in comparison to the true financing needs. So I think at this COP, we might look to sort of reset a new, more ambitious goal that is intimately tied to domestic policy. And so as Bea was talking about the budget conversations that's happening right now, there's deep challenges to actually get adaptation or loss and damage funding funded through the US Congress. So that's certainly a place that we're focused on as United Methodists. I know the interfaith community is focused on as well. So that finance piece. And then lastly, just on loss and damage, last thing I'll name, the Transitional Committee for Loss and Damage met this past week to outline how to operationalize funding arrangements to respond to loss and damage. This was a key breakthrough in the last COP. And in the last COP, we celebrated their collective willingness to address loss and damage with new financing. I think what's important now is how we take that sort of general commitment and operationalize it into a mechanism and actually provide that funding. So those are the major items, at least that I'm tracking, I think that are going to be the major conversation points. A lot of that aligns, Susan, with the statement that you all just developed in advance with the faith communities. So I'm hopeful. I think there is a deep acknowledgement of the shortcomings of our collective ambition. And I name that for us as the faith community as well. And I feel like this is a moment when we can really catalyze our own ambition and reflect that into this process.
That's great. It's such helpful information, John, and we really appreciate it. And, I think it leads perfectly into the question for Regina, which is to help us dig in a little more deeply on loss and damage. It's terminology that is a little bit hard to understand sometimes. The COP has its own language, just like so many things. And so Regina, I know you've been following this issue for a long time, and I wonder if you can help our audience just understand a little bit more about loss and damage. What is it? Why is it significant? And in particular, why should it be resonant with faith communities?
Thank you so much, Susan. And I also want to thank John for giving a great little primer there, right? So whenever I explain what loss and damage is, you kind of have to explain what it's not. So if 1.5 degrees Celsius is our goal, is what we're trying to max out at, that's still going to make changes to our environment. And so dealing with the changes that exist in our environment, if we can adapt to that, those are adaptations. And if we can see something coming down the road and we can make it be less bad than we anticipate it being, then that's mitigation. But what happens if we either go beyond 1.5, which given where we're going with the global stock take and everything else that's come to light, that's very likely. But even at 1.5, there were going to be problems, right? There were going to be storms, there were going to be wildfires here in my area. What do we do to address those losses and damages? And so it's taken 27 goes at the COP process, but we finally got it agendized and got a loss and damage fund at COP27. And I do want to put a little asterisk here so that we can come back to it. One of the things that when people ask what is the benefit of having the faith community at the COP, that is, you know, what good does it do to have our pastors and our imams and our other faith-based advocates at the COP? I was there, I saw it with my own two eyes that we were not going to get a loss and damage fund at COP27. And it was those faith leaders at the end who stuck it out and had those hard, faithful conversations that at least allowed our US delegation to be able to engage as fruitfully as they were able to engage at the 11th hour at COP27. So I said before, but I'm a firm believer now that that is our role to play in these negotiations. But as John also mentioned, we got the loss and damage fund at COP27. And then the transitional committee was supposed to figure out how to operationalize it. What is that going to do? And they've been working, and we thank them for their service. They have given a provisional report, and those of us who are in civil society who are looking at the whole UN process from a human rights standpoint, we've got some notes. So what we believe should be going on for the Loss and Damage Fund is that the fund should be based on common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. For those of you that are on the webinar with a legal background, we're talking about joint and several liability, right? My paying into the fund should not be contingent on somebody else's paying into the fund. My responsibilities are my responsibilities and yours are yours, and we're all coming together to do this thing. But recognizing that you are responsible because you are you. A big one, and one I hope that we get an opportunity to talk about how the faith community can be instrumental in ensuring that this fund does not create debt, right? And that opens up a whole can of worms, and I'm happy to have that a deeper conversation about that. But the conversation around creating debt and the related question of whether or not this fund is housed within and is a mechanism of the World Bank, that's such an important conversation, especially when we start talking about this fund being based on human rights and not necessarily exclusively on economics, right? And a fund that receives financial inputs from developed countries based on obligations. Those who would be paying into the fund are responsible for those losses and damages due to historic harms that have already existed. We would not be interested in having people negotiate away or attempt to negotiate away that responsibility. And those of us in civil society who have been watching these negotiations for a while are looking at the transitional committee's structure and it doesn't meet those needs. And there are many reasons for that, but maybe I can stop right there in terms of giving just a base primer of what we're looking at here for this coming COP. That's what we're going to be looking to do.
Thanks, Regina. That was incredibly helpful and really addressed some of the issues, including a question that had come up already about fair shares, and in particular, we've been talking about U.S. fair share. So we'll circle back to that question during the Q&A, but I know you started to get there with your response, so we really appreciate that. I'm going to turn back to Bea next. Bea, you've been participating in the COP since Paris in 2015 and emphasizing the role faith communities to push the U.S. government to pass much needed climate policies. And so, folks here on the call are, based all over the country, working in their faith communities and at the local level. I'd love for you to share a little bit about how this work looks on the ground and what role people of faith and conscience are playing in policy advocacy, for example, at the state level where you work.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Today, while we're here, my colleague Becca, who is our climate action fellow, is actually at the Texas Capitol at an event called the Texas Energy Summit, where she's talking with energy policymakers about how Texas is going to move forward on renewables, hopefully ramp down on fossil fuel. I'm sure there are a lot of people at the event who maybe would not have those same priorities, but that's our priorities. But I think the thing that has struck me since the first COP that I went to, and I will give all the credit to John Hill all the time for helping clarify this for me, is we're not at the COP to negotiate any agreements, right? So when you go to your capital in your state, or even if you go to Congress, you're not the policymaker, you're just there to lobby the policymaker. Well, that is true at the COP too. So we are not going there to make decisions, like Linnea said in the video. We're there to lobby, and the people who we're lobbying are people from our own country. So what's important is what we can say to them about conditions in our country. And if the people who we're lobbying, so if you think about lobbying your legislature, if you go to your member and say, all the people in the community think you should do, whatever activity, and they say, well, I've talked to a bunch of other people who disagree with you, then you have work to do. And it's not just to convince them, it's that you have to go back to your community and tell your community, I need to help you understand why you need to be on my side too. That's true for the COP, and it's true as an entire country. So the faith community in the United States, in lobbying the negotiators at the COP, needs to be able to represent fairly what the faith communities in the United States, at least, believe and are willing to do to help manifest whatever the decisions are that get taken at the COP. So if the faith communities from the United States go to the COP and talk to the members of the State Department negotiating team and say, I feel sure that all Americans want to pay more taxes so that we can pay into the Green Climate Fund, they will probably say, that's funny, we've heard different things than that from other people, right? So who we need to go back to and talk to is our own members of our own faith communities about why it's important to take whatever the action is. That's the thing. And it doesn't start at the federal level. It doesn't even start at the state level. It starts at the local level. So for just as an example, and I see that John Howard here is here from Houston, and he would be an excellent example of this too. In Austin, Texas, we have a climate plan, and many people who are on this call are from cities that have climate plans. You should know about your city's climate plan and make sure that the city is able to implement that climate plan as thoroughly as possible. And then be sure that your members of your legislature and your members of Congress know that that's true, that your city is all in. That's the way that this happens, is from the bottom up. So that's my, that would be my 2 cents on that.
Great, thanks, B. And you all do great work at the state and local levels there in Texas, as well as do many of our affiliates around the country who are doing similar work in equally difficult circumstances sometimes. So we really appreciate the work that all of you do. And it kind of leads us to this question about what folks can do to participate and interact with the COP from home. So I'm just going to ask our panelists to share a few things. So, first of all, if there are specific ways that each of you suggest that folks engage with those who are in Dubai this year or following along the negotiations virtually. John, let's start with you if you have some specific ideas for how folks can engage.
So I think one of the challenges is always to sort of stay awake to the conversations over the course of 2 weeks, right? And it's like a different language that is being used, right? So I think the first thing that folks, if we're kind of committed to this collective work of moving the needle in the climate negotiations, it's staying engaged. And then to B's point, it's staying connected to your sort of, if you're in the US, to your US decision makers, because folks can't go internationally and promise things they can't deliver at home. That's happened, and that's where we will always fall short of those promises. So we have to really build up more political will in the US for aggressive climate action so that folks can take action. So the best thing you can do from my vantage point is throughout the COP to be calling your members of Congress and saying, y'all need to do something on climate change. You need to do more funding for loss and damage for climate finance, because that's a live conversation in the US Congress right now. And the US negotiating team is not going to be able to go out further than what they'll be able to deliver back home in Congress. So that's one of the connections. And I'd love to at some point touch, I know there's a lot of comments about just sort of the efficacy of the COP process. And I think that's something that we should probably address. Susan, I'll let you be the moderator, but I think that's something I'd love to touch on before we close.
We will definitely, I see several questions around that as well. And I wanted to give Regina a chance to jump in on suggestions as well for how folks can participate from home.
So right about now, there are lists that are coming out of the climate mayors who are going to attend, and your state, so the governors who will attend. By all means, call your members of Congress, call your senator, let them know that you are a climate voter and that you are watching the COP process. But there is more than one level of government represented at the COP, and that have an opportunity to weigh in on this process and how the process is implemented when we get back home. I already have 2 meetings that are at the first of the year with legislators that I made a week ago because I found out that they were going, and I intentionally, they said, well, let's meet this week, November, the week of November now. And I'm like, no, let's meet after the COP. Let's take a look at what's going on at the COP and how we are or are not meeting our goals. And then let's have our conversation after that. They're going to have some new ideas. I'm going to have some new ideas. If you're a mayor, if you're assembly member, if you're state senator, if your board of commissioners commissioner is going to the COP or sending staff to the COP, make a meeting for early January where you talk to them about what came out of this. Play the long game. It is also true that in American politics, your next member of Congress is right now a mayor or a state senator or something else like that. Get in, start having those conversations now, build that relationship up now. We at the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America are just now putting together our COP package. So if you're not already following us on all the socials, that would be an excellent way to do it. And if you are in the state of California and you would like to follow us at loppca.org, I'm going to be having a blog and everything for my time at the COP. So feel free to join us on our socials as well.
That's fantastic. What great ideas in terms of setting up those meetings now for after the COP. Really good advice for folks. And definitely, we know that one of the main things that we can do to act on climate is to talk about it. And we need to talk about it with people who are in decision-making positions. And certainly that applies to all levels of government. So thanks for that great suggestion. As well, you can follow IPL blog posts on the IPL website. We're going to drop the link to where we post our blogs, and you can follow along there. Some of the folks on this call will be invited to share blogs there as well. So we'll be not just the IPL team there, but other partners. We're seeking out faith leaders who are at the COP to be part of that blog. And so I want to go back to Regina with the question around the U.S. fair shares. So I wonder if you could provide a little context for folks about what that means. You were talking about how we have differentiated responsibilities, and I think folks might be interested that there is an effort to get the U.S. to pay its fair share.
Forgive me, I'm figuring out a new computer over here. Yeah, so for the duration, one of the tactics, one of the truths of the United States is our negotiators say, but it's hard to decide how much any one country is owed, and at what date do we say that we are going to measure the losses and damages. And for those of you who are familiar with the U.S. Legal context, it's the fear of accepting liability, because if we say that we are liable for 12% of historic carbon emissions, are we on the hook for 12% of all of the losses and damages that happen into the future in perpetuity? And that's a difficult question, right? And, as a global citizen, I feel some type of way. And as a US taxpayer, I feel some type of way. And, rational minds could differ. And I'm not a finance expert, but what I do know is that our loss and damage fund shouldn't be donor driven. The instrumentalities that pay into the fund should not be the instrumentalities that decide where those funds go. It shouldn't be donor driven. This is not a charity. And we can also have a conversation about the difference between charity and justice, but paying into loss and damage, not a charity. So we're not picking and choosing our favorite islands to save and non-economic losses that we're going to try to protect. And frankly, it needs to be the loss and damage fund needs to be capitalized in such a way that it is the developed countries that bear most of the responsibility. And again, I'm not a finance expert, but that is getting at the difference between historic emissions and current emissions. That's having a conversation about China and India. And I'm not a citizen in China or India. I can't speak to that. I just know that the U.S. Should be paying its fair share. And the fund should be accountable to frontline communities, and that is exactly what it sounds like. So I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but that's where our advocates' hearts and minds are leading right now for this COP.
Great. Thanks, Regina. ICB wants to add something as well.
Yeah, I just want to kind of weigh in, and I guess I'll weigh in two ways. One is from a state that is particularly problematic on this issue, kind of from start to finish, and also as probably relative to a lot of climate advocates, relatively moderate in my own approach. And what I would say is, it is not necessary for the United States to assume liability or admit wrongdoing or anything like that. And it's not necessary. It is a good project to identify what the fair share would be of American responsibility for all the stuff that we're going to have to deal with. But what is true is the United States has a lot of resources, and we have a political system that would allow us, if we can figure out how to get it sort of rebalanced, would allow us to choose to make contributions relatively quickly and in a way that would do what Regina says, which is to decouple who's giving the money from who is making the decision about who gets it. It's really important that that Americans not get wound up in whether it is or isn't the case that we're responsible and what exactly the percentage would be and all that, and to focus on, like, foreign aid is important. It is important to pay into a loss and damage fund, because Congress is never, ever, ever gonna appropriate money for the purpose of admitting liability as a country, right? Where that's never gonna happen. It doesn't matter which party's in power. So better to focus really hard on, we need to put money in. It is a global problem and we got to do it. We got to pay some money into this. That's what I would urge everyone to focus on.
Thanks, Bea. It certainly speaks to our values as people of faith, to work from a place of love and compassion, especially for those who are vulnerable and suffering around our world. And we know that is, very much the intention behind the loss and damage fund, is to alleviate some amount of distress and displacement that's already happening because of climate change. So John, I want to come back to you. We have a number of questions that have been submitted that have something to do with the efficacy of the COP. And so I'm going to read just one from Margaret. She says, given the huge number of corporate polluters who attend COP meetings, and given the fact that the leader of this year's COP is a backer of fossil fuels, how do you respond to the claim that COP is merely greenwashing? And do you still have faith that COP can be a vehicle for transformation?
I know I asked for this question, and I will admit that it is a super difficult answer, and it is something that I ask myself often in these settings. I think one thing that we should all keep in mind is that diplomacy is hard, diplomacy is complicated, diplomacy is slow. I'm in some ways reminded of the second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, who talked about the UN not being, was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but to keep us from going to hell. And there's something to me in, this consensus-driven process that, and to remind folks that the COP is a meeting of the parties, and in order for any decision to be made, every party has to agree to it, right? So that means Saudi Arabia has to agree to it. That means Fiji has to agree to it, right? So that process is not built to mobilize quick, speedy leaps and bounds in action, but there is strength in that consensus-driven process in terms of norm setting, in terms of ambition setting, in terms of sort of collective and cooperative action. And just as, like, when I think about consensus-driven process, I often think about, the folks who are standing in the way from what we want. Also name that is a process that enables any party to stand up and object. And so we've been in this process. I remember in Warsaw, at the Warsaw COP when Typhoon Haiyan was bearing down on the Philippines, and the delegate from the lead negotiator from the Philippines stood up, Yeb Sanyo, and basically halted the proceedings, right, and called out the inaction. And that is what gave birth to this loss and damage fund that we're now finally operationalizing, right? And so I think that there is power in the individual party and thinking about the ways in which the collective can inform other parties. So I'm thinking about before Paris and the Climate Vulnerable Forum had a transformative effect on President Obama and really changed the red lines for the US and led to the process that ultimately we came out with the Paris Agreement. So I hear the question. I think it's totally valid. I think there is not another process for us to engage in that brings all actors on the global stage together to try and find a solution to this global problem. And that really does elevate the voices of communities deeply impacted. And so that's my kind of argument for continued participation in this process, even as I acknowledge that, yes, at the end of the day, this is not the process that makes the transformation we need as quickly as we would like. And in truthfulness, that is transformation that we need to be about individually and collectively, and we cannot be relying on governments to be our saviors, right? So there is a role for the government, there's a role for the international community, and there's deeply a role for us at every level to take action.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I know we're running short on time, and we have some questions we haven't gotten to yet. A couple of questions that folks have popped in here are some questions about how they can find out who their local leaders are and members of Congress are who are attending the COP. I think maybe there was a link that was put in the chat about that, but if not, do folks want to share quickly where they might be able to find that information? Bea, do you want to address that?
I'm sorry, say the question again.
Folks would like to know where they can find the list of their, say, mayors or members of Congress who are attending the COP.
No, you know what? Regina is the person who brought that up. I don't actually know right now where you would find that information.
So when the agenda gets finalized, it's amazing to me that we are 10 days from inviting the world to a giant conference, and we do not yet have a itemized agenda. Once the itemized agenda comes out in terms of which pavilions every meeting that is happening that entire 2 weeks, it will have a list of everyone who attends. The governor of the state of California, usually for the last 4 years, has put out a list of everyone that he knows that is a California official, and that goes on his website. I'm expecting that in a day or two. It would make sense for you to look, if you're not in California, to look at your governor's website. That's the kind of thing that they like to tout, that their folks go to. And then Susan, I think maybe together we can just post to the UNFCCC agenda, and then just scroll and take a look for names. And then the U.S. delegation also puts out who are, because the people I found this out at maybe a COP or two ago, that this is a big plenary session. So if you've ever been to church council, if you've ever been to your local organizations, and you've got those delegate people who have to sit there for each and every boring speech in the giant room. Well, the U.S. members who have to sit in that giant room are local officials all over the country, and they get nominated by their governor. They get nominated by their party. That's who it is. And so the U.S. will tell who is in that piece of the delegation. If it happens to be one of your locals, that's a great person to have a conversation with. I've made several really good contacts with people who are state and local officials. They care about climate change, they do, but that's not their area of expertise. And this was just something that they got roped into doing, and now they are wide-eyed and ready to go. That is the best group to grab if you happen to get an opportunity to do that. So those opportunities are coming. They're not out yet, but when they are, they'd be great resources.
Great, thank you so much. I know we are out of time. We want to share just a couple of suggestions. I know one of the questions was what do we need to ask decision makers for? And lucky for all of you who are here, we have a letter to the Biden administration and the State Department. Folks are the lead negotiators in this case for the U.S. And we have a letter going to them ahead of COP28. So we're dropping a link in the chat to that letter where you can sign as a person of faith with some high level asks. And of course, we'll be happy to update you during the COP if there's anything specific that we want you to reach out to your policymakers about. We'll be sharing that information as well. And we will be doing a post-COP webinar as well, a wrap up. And so there will likely be some things that will come out of that we're asking you to take to either your local, state, or federal policymakers, members of Congress, and set up those meetings as Regina suggested, get those set up and on the books ahead of time so you can share some direct asks with them as well. It always feels like COP is sort of a once a year thing, but really this needs to be ongoing work throughout the year. So this is not your only opportunity to participate in this process. We also have resources available on the IPL website, including worship resources that you can use in your faith community during COP. We're dropping that link into the chat as well. And of course, we are continuing to share the Path of Hope resource developed by Texas Impact and Texas Interfaith Power and Light as a resource for you to use in your place of worship as well. And then again, we just invite you to follow along with the blogs. And I know other folks here, you can follow along with them as well, and also on social media. So look for us there. And as soon as we have a date for that post-COP webinar, we will share that with you and let you know when you can expect to come back as well for that. So I want to thank all of you for being a part of this important conversation. I know we didn't have time to get to all of the questions, but if you have other questions, you can please send them to info@interfaithpowerandlight.org, and we'll do our best to answer those. And we will share the recording and the links from today's webinar via email with you tomorrow as well. And I want to thank our three panelists today, some of my favorite folks to work with, B. Moorhead and Regina Banks and John Hill. Thank you so much for being here, for your expertise, for all the things that you've shared to help folks engage in this process. It's really important work, and it's great to be doing this in community with all of you. So thank you, blessings to all of you, and take good care.